I'm Gabriela Lemus. To those of you who don't know me, I am the Executive Director of Maryland Latinos Unidos, and I'm really excited to have you all here. Just feel free to put your name and your organization in the chat, and also please put down where you're from or where you're at, not so much where you're from, but where you're at right now. So for example, I'm in Silver Spring. I'm really curious to see if we're from, what parts of Maryland we're from. And just by way of format, we'll have a discussion. Susana and I, we're waiting on our other speaker. We're not sure if he's okay or not. We think he is. So hopefully he'll join us shortly. But we still have, Susana and I, we were just saying we could probably talk for hours and hours about this topic. We're both pretty fascinated and passionate about it. I think we're going to have a fantastic discussion today. So let me start with my usual monologue, and also with the thought that at the end we have a Q&A session, last 10 minutes, and feel free to place questions in the chat as well, or thoughts as you hear what we're saying. Okay, let's get rolling. So when I started putting this together, I was really thinking a lot about Thanksgiving. So, it's next week, and I really wanted to raise it up because it's such a unique holiday. It's a holiday that doesn't really have a religious affiliation. It's really about gathering and family and friends and being very intentional and grateful for the bounty that we have with our family, friends, etc. And and it's also a time, I think, because it's fall, right? It's autumn, to appreciate those we've lost, and thank them for the inheritance that they've given us, their wisdom, their love, and their formation of us, right? We all form each other. And I also wanted to take this opportunity before we start to simply say thank you to all of you for always being interested in MLU's work, for always showing up with curiosity and love and ganas. And what is ganas? Ganas is the will to do something, and the ability to overcome, and the desire to do better, and to help out, and to be of service and get things done, right? And so mil gracias to all of you for being here. And that translates to 1,000 thank yous. I also want to lift up the fact that November is National Native American Heritage Month. And it's a month to acknowledge and celebrate Indigenous peoples, past and present. It's a month meant to honor tribal sovereignty and the promotion of tribal self-determination. So I have a really weird, I'm a nerd, right? So the White House, I always go to the White House because I always like I like reading the proclamations. So I wanted to read the White House's proclamation this year, and it really struck a chord with me. I'm going to read a very short paragraph for you because I think it helps frame part of what we're talking about today. America has not always delivered on its promise of equal dignity and respect for Native Americans. For centuries, broken treaties, dispossession of ancestral lands, and policies of assimilation and termination sought to decimate Native populations and their ways of life. But despite this painful history, Indigenous peoples, their governments, and their communities have persevered and flourished. That's ganas, right? Persevering and flourishing, right? You overcome. It goes on to say, we are also helping Native communities heal from intergenerational trauma caused by past policies. And what's striking is an important part of what the government's project in this area is going to be, is to shed light on the harmful history of forced cultural assimilation and investing in tribal language revitalization. And I thought that was interesting in so many ways, because language and forced cultural assimilation are kind of part of what is behind our discussion today on English language learning. And we may not use those exact terms, but we're talking about, becoming something, right? And also, since it is Native American Heritage Month, and before I go any further, I want to acknowledge our Indigenous brothers and sisters on whose lands we currently reside here in Maryland. the Akahannock, the Assateague, the Choptank, Delaware, the Mattapique, Nanticoke, the Piscataway, the Pocomoke, and the Shawnee. I'm sure I missed some, and I may have even mispronounced a few. But I want to thank them for welcoming us to the shores of your native lands. I want to thank you for bringing us to the shores of, and welcoming us here. And thank you for staying true to the vision of what harmony with Mother Earth means. And thank you for your wisdom and willingness to educate the rest of us who have not been blessed with such knowledge, right? And today I want to frame our discussion with these thoughts because we all come from somewhere. And when we arrive, we have to learn how to adapt to a new culture and local customs. And this happens everywhere. And the United States and Canada and most European nations have some bad habits with regards to this issue. And they, it's what we're evolving from, right? But basically there's a temptation to force new arrivals into a different way of thinking and being, instead of helping acclimate and learning, making it a symbiotic process. And this is where I want to go back to the statement in the White House's proclamation about intergenerational trauma, because intergenerational trauma is very, very real. But it's also part of the English language learning and language acquisition, though perhaps it's less evident. But it informs us. It informs how and whether children are prepared to learn. So today we have two individuals. Is Frank here? I'm sorry. And we're going to have a really deep conversation. I've come to know and deeply appreciate their knowledge, and they have incredible compassion towards children and families, and helping them find their way in the process of becoming American, right? And what does that mean exactly? Because I think you may have heard me say this previously, but becoming American, it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight, and English language learning is critical to the success of any community that comes to a new country. Why? Because it makes a difference in very real ways about how much money you can make, whether or not you can, have access to services, how you gain access to services. And it helps you if you want to buy a home or start a business or even start a nonprofit. There are, different types of language within language, and this is all part of what we have to do, right? And learning language is a very complex process because our brains are adapted for language learning from birth for the most part. But as we get older, our brains are less flexible. I wanted to tell you a little bit about this because I'm the product of what I call the multiple language acquisition experiments. I have been through rote memorization models. I have had bilingual education, and I've been in deep immersion. I speak, read, and write in 5 languages, right? But only in 3 am I actually fluent, where I would say, English, Spanish, and French, where I would say I can go easily between all 3. And the other 2, sadly, I'm losing them. I don't use them as much. And that's all part of this process. And this is deep, right? When you try to do all of this. So how do we create policies, right? And how do we create, processes, right? For something that's really a neurological process. It's just a different way of thinking about it. So I'm going to turn it over to Susana to briefly introduce herself, tell us where you work and what you do, and also maybe share a little bit about why you got involved in Community Well. Now, Community Well, for the audience, is the community working group for English language learners. Why did we form this? Because I was kind of part of it, but I came in a secondary layer, right, after it was already up and running. And why are you a part of it? Like, what does this mean for you? Welcome, Susana.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Good morning, everyone. So I work with Disability Rights Maryland. I am an outreach coordinator, and it's a nonprofit that works with people with disabilities. I specifically work with the education unit. So the reason why I started with it was like the very beginning. Frank found out that the blueprint for education, they had
the Kerwin Commission, right?
the Kerwin Commission, yes. But then there was going to be funding, and they're deciding what the funding was how they were going to distribute the funding. And he found out that there was a work group deciding on how they were going to do this for the ELL population, but nobody there had any ELL background, or they were not, everybody was, born in the United States. So
This is, okay.
yeah,
This was
so
the school system?
This is the State Department of Education. So,
okay.
And then, so when they're deciding, they were about to decide, what they were going to do with the funding and how it was going to be used. And he was really worried about, not having input from people that actually needed it. The people that, what their needs actually were. So it was a very small group. It was him and Owen, who is an ESOL teacher in Anne Arundel County Community College, and it was mostly ESOL teachers, and so he knew. I have known Frank for a long time, and he knows I'm very passionate about language access.
Yeah, it really shows when you're in meetings with you. It's really obvious.
Yeah. So I am very passionate. Well, I am a product of receiving ESOL services. I am a product of having parents that did not have equal language access. And then, so, I saw all of that, and firsthand. So I said I would do that. I would speak for those that cannot speak. So that's what I do. But so that's how it all started. It was we are very grassroots, and we started writing letters to the commission, and we made enough noise that they had a meeting with us, and then they had a town hall where they had listening sessions, and they started including non-English speakers for the other.
So in a very short period of time, you had a lot of impact.
We did, yes. So it was.
And how old is Well?
It's less than a year old.
Right.
So,
we just started last summer, right?
Yes. So we have done a lot, but what it is we are, we're very organized. We have a focus, right? And Frank from ACLU, he has been a great leader, and some of us cannot put our thoughts together, but he's really great at guiding our thoughts and putting it. And then we have some really outspoken leaders, like Almost from LEAF, and Rocio Macet, and then Lucia Islas from Comité Latino. So there's several teachers from different places, different counties. So it's not just one area. So and we have some students who are also ESOL students that receive ESOL services. So yeah, we're very.
And that's what I love about the group, is you really have put together a combination of practitioners and community advocates and researchers and people who understand policy. And it's really, because I came in pretty late, right? And by the time I come in, I'm watching and listening to all of you, and you're really trying to build something better. And all of that knowledge is being applied to building out these policies. I love that model of policy and planning. Okay, I see that Frank has joined us. Hi,
I
Frank.
apologize. I'm going to apologize to the whole group because I actually thought it was at 10. And then I looked back at emails and I'm like, oh, I was wrong. So I apologize, everyone.
It's all good. It's all good. You're here now. So Frank, we've been opening up with introductions, and that's Susanna. Before I hand it over to Frank, anything else you would like to add?
No, not right now. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Okay, Frank, it's all yours. Please share, open up with, give us a little introduction, who you are, what you do, but also talk a little bit, just very lightly, about how, this is what Susanna was sharing, how we started Community Well, how you started Community Well,
Sure.
and what laid
We,
behind it. Well,
sure.
yes, we did, but you guys really got the ball rolling. I was a latecomer.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. I'm Frank Patinella. I work as a senior education advocate for the ACLU of Maryland. I've been doing this for 15 years now, so I'm tired. But also
That's so good
at
at
the
what you
same
do.
time, energetic about this work still. It's really amazing work. And I appreciate everyone in the space, working on education issues in schools and community. I think we're in a really special moment now.
Mhm.
We at the ACLU, we got involved with education back in the mid-90s. And if folks know the ACLU, you might be familiar with just the normal free speech, police accountability and reform,
Civil
those
liberties.
issues that we've been working on, immigration issues, women's issues. So we've been working on these constitutional rights for a long time, but education is kind of an outlier. But every state in the country has some kind of provision in their constitution that guarantees a quality education. Ours says that our state is required to provide an adequate education for all students and provide by taxation or otherwise for their maintenance. So back in the mid-90s, we filed a lawsuit against the state on behalf of Baltimore City parents of school children. And the lawsuit contended that the state was not providing adequate funding to Baltimore City schools. And to make a long story short, we won that lawsuit. The state set up what was called the Thornton Commission at the time and recommended a new funding formula, which called for 1.3 billion statewide. So our lawsuit really triggered an initiative that benefited schools statewide. That 1.3 million came through in the Thornton law, but in 2008, the state cut the Thornton funding law. So planned increases in education funding were lost. In 2012, the Thornton law also required the state to reevaluate the education funding formula to make sure it was meeting constitutional adequacy, right? And they hired a consultant to produce a report. That report said somewhere around 2.9 billion was needed, in addition to what the schools were already receiving. And instead of just taking those recommendations, the state set up in 2016 the Kerwin Commission, which maybe most of you have heard of by now. And the Kerwin Commission had the task of overhauling the education funding formula to make sure that it met constitutional adequacy. And second, they established new framework for education reform, which includes early learning, pre-K for all 4-year-olds, for 3-year-olds from low-income families. It also expands the infants and toddler programs, Judy centers, Patty centers. So these are services for families birth to kindergarten. More resources for struggling learners, academic supports, after-school programming, wraparound services for families to address barriers to learning, mental health, healthcare, school-based healthcare. It addresses teacher policy and aims to increase teacher salaries to a baseline of $60,000 with the opportunity for teachers to work their way up a career ladder to earn more, but also stay in the classroom. It calls for recruiting more, recruiting and retaining more racially and ethnically diverse teachers, which is a focus in our report.
Mhm. That's
And
right.
obviously very much needed. And it also modernizes college and career pathways for students. In terms of the community,
Modernizes them how?
I'm sorry.
Modernizes them how?
Oh, well, there's going to be more work done by the Blueprint Accountability and Implementation Board. So I'm not sure how much folks know here, but there's a whole new board that oversees this $3.8 billion blueprint for Maryland's future plan based on the Kerwin recommendations, and generally focused on those categories I mentioned. So they just came out with an implementation plan for districts to start to implement these reforms,
Oh,
but
very
there's a lot not figured out,
Right.
including all the details about college and career readiness. But the idea is to modernize the pathways so that certificates or any kind of licensure that can be acquired aligned with current modern the modern economy, so that students have the skills to actually participate in the economy. Are
So more
actually schools.
technology,
Yes.
and then also making it more accessible, right? Like,
Right.
and how they approach. Yeah, that makes sense. So let's talk about the report a little bit then. We have put together this report. You've been our leader and guru in this entire process, Frank. Why Community Well decided to put the report out now? What was our logic behind that? And then what is the framework of our report in context of the Kerwin Commission and well, just what we've all been experiencing in education, right?
Right. This is a loaded question, and I want to
It's a
first.
loaded question. Yes, it is. Pick it apart and pick your
Sure.
poison.
So I want to first say that I am not the expert in English learner policy, right? I was a social worker in a school where there was a third of the population Latino kids, and a third white and a third Black in South Baltimore. But that's the extent, and I did that for a couple of years. That's the extent of my experience in the classroom, right? So the approach to Community Well for me was, and I, as a policy advocate, and our values and our framework at the ACLU is about really lifting up the voices of people who are on the ground working in schools, and also people who are impacted by the policies and practices in schools. So my thinking behind Community Well was that, right? It's pull people in, and we grew to I think 30 or over 30 people.
Yeah, it's a pretty big coalition.
There's about a dozen of us that participated in the actual writing of the report, and that was the goal. It was what is let me back up a little bit. So the whole 3.8 blueprint education reform plan, including all those components, that's going to be implemented. We're just in the first year, at the very beginning of this 10-year implementation plan. The blueprint law also set up MSDE's Blueprint Work Group on English language learners, and they got started in September or August 2021. And I reached out to a couple of my colleagues who I know follow English learner policy, and I asked them, he's like, do you know anything that, do you know what's going on with this Blueprint Work Group on English language learners? Because their whole charge is to develop and reform English learner policies in schools, right? This all fits within the context of implementing this big blueprint plan. So we did some digging. We found out that MSDE was meeting already. They appointed a commission and a work group, and they started meeting. And we're like, well, how do we learn what's going on? Nothing was posted. Meetings were happening. They weren't streamed. No one knew anything about it. So we wrote a letter immediately and said, like, you should open up these meetings, make this transparent, post the materials online, stream the meetings, allow for public input and testimony. And they did quickly. And then we grew our group, and we're like, well, we need to be involved. We need to get people, impacted folks, involved at the table. So that was the whole reason behind forming the Community Work Group on ELL, or Community Well. And we've been working since then. We sent another letter to MSDE asking if we could present our issues, right, to this work group on ELL. And we did that last winter, right? There's a number of, I think, Susanna and Gabriela, you were part of that.
This is when we, so we had a kind of a town hall with Superintendent Chowdhury, and it was
This was a
really,
different one. This
Oh,
one
this was a
when
different one?
we presented to the work group.
Oh, that's right. Yes,
MSD
I was
work group.
part of that. My
Right.
bad. I actually spoke.
Right. So we
That was the
presented
first
to the
one.
work group. So this is the body that is creating or developing recommendations for English learners. And we saw in their interim report that, you know, that they're focused on dual language programs in schools, right? And immersion programs. And there were some things that were very surfacey in terms of doing better on communication and making a welcoming school and all that, and diversifying the teachers, but it was very surfacey, right? So we wanted to dig in a bit. We talked about just, you know, with that work group, a lot of our members were talking about just the lack of communication, the lack of bilingual staff or communications coming out in the language they understand, meetings happening where there's not an interpreter or an interpreter that is not of quality.
Yeah.
And just all these issues that, you know, most people know, all these barriers that, you know, and when you're, you know, the work group, the MSD work group, no one really knew who was on this work group. Yet these are the folks like Susanna that has been in this space for decades, right? People like you, right? And other people. And so we're like, well, we're going to put together this group. So we presented to MSDE. Then we did that listening session, right? Gabriela and Susanna, we put together a listening session where we asked MSDE to be our guests. Chowdhury co-sponsored it with us, and it was great to see. We had somewhere around 100 people statewide.
It was great.
Yeah. And there was a lot of MSDE staff in each of the breakout rooms just listening to people. And we heard from the participants that, wow, this is the first time anyone has asked me, you know, anything about our experience in schools. So this is how we've been trying to gather information. We wanted this policy report to be informed by and written by those most impacted.
Let's see, let me do one thing here. So I wanted to ask Susanna specifically, because like you just said, she's been doing this for decades, right? You really, throughout the meetings, I loved listening to you, because you always like come in with all this like real knowledge, right? So what was your approach to the framing? Like, what was important to you, and why was it important for you to be there given the unique communities you work with? Talk a little bit about your disabilities work as well, and how this plays with this English language learner process.
Yes, well, it's very important to me because I lived it, right? So that there is the number one. I have lived it, and then I still see that even though there's progress, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And a friend of mine, the phrase that she uses is nothing for us without us. And like Frank says, you know, he's sympathetic, but he doesn't, you know, he has not experienced some of the things that we experience. So to me, that's very important. I also see one of the advantages of my work at Disability Rights Maryland is that I have been able to work all throughout the state. So some of the members are based in one city or one district. I had the privilege of having participated in meetings and have gone to individual schools all throughout the state of Maryland. Not all of Maryland, but through different places. So I can see differences, and I can also see similarities, and I can see how it works better in one place and not in the other. So that made it very important to me. The other thing is I need to speak out and remind people. A lot of people say bilingual, and I need to remind people it's not just Spanish, because everybody thinks, or if they see me and they know that I speak Spanish, they automatically only think Spanish. And I think that we need to remember that it's native language. Whatever and it's not just Spanish. There are many other languages spoken.
That's right.
So I'm the one that will keep saying that over and over, and you will always hear me say that, because things that get translated to Spanish, English, and maybe French sometimes, but there needs to be language access. Language access needs to be done. And I think also
that is one of our policy priorities, universal language access. I think that's just
is teaching people how to work with interpreters and understanding that provided the interpreter will catch up with whatever I say. People find it inconvenient when they are using an interpreter to slow down, or people that are the audience find it impolite to say, please slow down because I am not understanding. So they feel like an interpreter is a favor to them, and they don't understand that, especially in the school setting or anywhere that has federal funding, it's a right. So I am there to remind people that you need to slow down, you need to learn to work. But I think that what needs to happen is everybody should go to a meeting and have the meeting in another language.
In another language, right?
And use an interpreter and see what it's like when somebody has an interpreter for you. And I think until you do that, you will understand how it feels.
Yeah, it's true. It's absolutely true. You feel a little off kilter, right? You don't really know if what you're hearing is absolutely correct or if you understood it correctly. So you want to go into details maybe a little bit more, and you don't always have time and people are rushed. And it is there. I think that's a really valuable point. So this is a question for both of you. And it's kind of big thinking, right? Big challenges, big barriers, opportunities facing the ELL community in Maryland. And also, Susana, you said you've worked in different parts of the state. Maybe talk a little bit about the differences among the community. Who wants to start?
I'll start. So I am very bothered, for example, by Baltimore County, because Baltimore County basically segregates ELL students. They put them in area schools. So if you have to receive ELL services, you have to go to area schools. You are bused. You don't go to your neighborhood. That means you don't really participate, because you don't participate in any after school activities. Some schools, they have a wing for the ESOL classes, so they are basically on their own. So Baltimore County, I think, to me, is the worst when it comes to to services for students, because it's segregation, pure and simple. Some counties are awesome. They have wonderfully trained interpreters, but the schools don't treat the students equally. Now, I'm not making a generalization. Some schools are wonderful. That's just how it is. That's just what I witnessed. Some schools have liaisons, but the liaisons are also interpreters, and they decide what they will tell the staff. Yeah, so they become the gatekeepers, I guess you would say. So those are some barriers that I have found, and it's systematic. It's not just one place, but it's systematic.
So Frank, your turn.
Sure. I actually learned a lot over the past year, just being in this group with the 30 others. And so some of my thinking comes from that experience. But let me start with funding. That's my area of expertise.
No, and it's also a big part of this.
Yes. I mean, obviously, schools need to have a solid foundation of funding for anything to be to work, right, at the school. If you're
Absolutely.
short-staffed, then teachers are stretched, then students aren't getting the attention they need. Teachers burn out, they leave, there's turnover, right? So funding is critically important. My criticism of this Kerwin or blueprint plan all along has been that when the commission, the Kerwin Commission, developed the funding formula for the state, which was eventually passed into law, it didn't provide the rationale for how they adjusted the formula. So we see a total of $3.8 billion on top of what's already provided. That's significant. I'm not going to lie. That's a lot of money.
That is a lot of money.
And it's going to be phased in incrementally over the next 10 years. So by year 10, we should see all of that money phased in. But back to this idea of constitutional adequacy in court, it was that is defined as the amount of funding needed for students to meet standards adopted by the state itself, right? So when the formula was developed, what I saw was how and this gets a bit technical, and I'm going to try to convey this in a way that's easy to
Keep
understand.
it human, Frank.
Yes, I'm trying to not wonk out on y'all. But I saw how they increase just the base per pupil amount for every school, and it included increases in funding for specific blueprint programs like pre-K, like the teacher salary, like blah, 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 right? But it did not address the existing significant gaps in funding adequacy that existed before. So what they did was they built upon an inadequate base, and the districts that are suffering the most in terms of meeting that adequate level of funding target that the state itself set, right? This goes back to the Thornton era. They're the districts of low wealth, the lowest wealth districts have the deepest gaps in their funding now. So Baltimore City, in 2017, the state reported that $342 million was missing or lost in their budget because of the cut to the education funding law back in 2008.
Wow.
So it's a compounding effect in Prince George's County, where we have a lot of ELLs, right?
Big problem.
$503 million is the gap. As counties get wealthier, those gaps get smaller, right? Because when there's a state cut, since districts of lower wealth are more dependent on state funding and less dependent on their local government to provide, it hits those districts the hardest, right? Wealthier districts, when there's a state cut, it doesn't hurt them as much because they have much more coming from their local budget because they're wealthier. So they did not fix that wealth issue or those gaps. So we're still calling, bringing attention to that, because it's going to affect how the level of resources and what's possible in schools for English language learners. And the other piece I want to highlight here is, I think, related to what Susana said. And once we complete the report, we'll be happy to send it to everyone. But there's a whole section on cultural responsiveness and just in general, a framework for schools to ensure that they are culturally competent, right? Culturally responsive, intentionally and comprehensively anti-racist. Because what we're finding is that, families, students, when they're not getting what they need, whether they're placed in a wrong grade or in a wrong course because the school didn't do their due diligence in terms of understanding the child's educational history, right? When students and families don't get the materials translated correctly in their language or not in a timely manner, they're missing things.
Right.
All these issues. The overall message is that if a school is to be culturally competent, and that language is in the blueprint bill, right? So we're pushing on that. Like, okay, now what does that mean? But for schools to be culturally competent, we're saying that schools, they need to switch their whole thinking, and they need to be advocates for the children, right? Like Susanna is, like you are, like others on this call are, like Denora Almos of Latino
Right.
Advancing.
Education.
They're
Yeah.
always educating parents in terms of how to navigate the school system, right? How to get
Right.
the services they need, how to call for an IEP meeting or an assessment on a disability,
Mhm.
right? And parents get lost and confused, and they get, I think, a lot of times just dismissed, and perhaps that's a funding issue because there's not the capacity, but it's also a cultural issue,
Right.
and that these students are not valued as English speakers are, right?
Right.
They're different. There are different tiers here. So we think that cultural responsiveness, there needs to be framework, such
Right.
as a model like culturally relevant pedagogy, or
Right.
culturally responsive teaching and learning, right? Or culturally sustaining pedagogy. But all of those share a lot of the same principles and tenets, right? That, schools and school staff need to have extensive training in race equity, right?
So,
They-
yeah, let me ask you, let me
Sure.
take this because we're getting close to time here.
Sure.
Talk to us about the students. Tell us about kids in ELL programs, like kind of how is Maryland faring? How are they faring? Do you have a sense of that? And also there's a question in the chat
Mhm.
that I think is really important related to COVID and its impact on well, obviously graduation rates and on ELL learners. Like, how does that sort of intersect with next steps for the Kerwin Commission and ELL language? I keep wanting to say English language acquisition, but ELL students is what I mean to say.
If you're just looking at the test scores, I'm looking at an MSDE report right now on proficiency in various subjects, and ELL is at the very bottom everywhere in all the student groups.
But they've been saying that they've made improvements.
Not enough, apparently.
Not enough.
These are 20,
But that
this
their
is the
outcomes
20
were improved.
These are 2022 reports, and I've been reading, and I haven't seen all the recent data and compared it across, the years, but I've been reading that English learners, students of low income, students with disabilities, the gap between them and their non-disabled peers and English learners is growing because of the COVID impact, right?
Right.
Because that pandemic hit those students harder.
That was part of the U.S. Department of Education report that came out about the impacts of COVID on education generally. And yes, English language learners and children with disabilities had more, well, it was just dislocating them.
And the other thing is, I learned here at an MLU, this identity report, right? Where it showed that Latino students in elementary grades had a much more positive outlook about their future, about who they are, their self-esteem. And once they get into high school, that self-confidence gets lost, right? They start to backtrack. Maybe they become more aware of their place in society.
That's really,
all those barriers in
that.
front of them as Latino students. Other English language learners, I think, experience the same kind of thing. And so I come back to this whole—
It's like an isolation almost.
Yeah. So I come back to the whole cultural responsiveness. If that is true across the board for students from other countries or even native-born English learners, then we need an approach that is culturally responsive, so that other metrics for student well-being, are front and center, like their identity, right? Their sense of identity or esteem or self-determination, self-efficacy, these things. And those models, culturally responsive teaching and learning, they get at those metrics, right?
Right. And metrics, go ahead, Susanna.
I have to add something. Having two daughters who just recently graduated, the youngest one, and having seen a lot of their friends, I think that the one thing that we need to do is have role models come to the schools that look like them and say, despite what anybody else is telling you, despite everything, look at me, I made it, and this is what I did. And I think that's lacking, because they bring a lot of resources to the school, but not resources. That's changing,
not human resources, not people resources,
and not ones that look
like them. Yeah, what is it? Delegate Pena-Melnick says all the time, you can't be what you can't see. Right? So we have 10 minutes. There's a request for sharing data with the group. So if you're ready to have us share the report, I would love to share it with them afterwards, but whenever you're ready. Frank, I know it's been quite a process, and you're doing all the editing. So we're all a coalition here of friends and allies, and I like to say coalition, but we're all interested in this information. Do any of you have questions you want to ask of Frank and Susana and their experiences? If not, you know me, I can keep talking for days. Yeah. Okay. Well, the other thing I wanted to ask you about, well, let's see, I already asked you that part. So what about adults? How do adults fit in here? Because some of this is the parental piece that we've spoken about, but also children with English as a second language oftentimes may be born here, right? They may be not have had the support at home when they were very small. So talk a little bit about adults and its like the limitations and opportunities that there are with all of these changes.
I just want to clarify, you want to know adults that grew up as English language learners, or the
yeah, I would say, yeah, either growing up as English language learners or new arrivals and parents and who need to acquire English language. And so the impact it has on their children, because they may not have, even if their children are US citizens, they may not have been brought up as babies speaking English first, right? So often they end up in the ELL program. So are there any opportunities for adults as well to benefit from these changes?
I think so. I think all the schools have, especially the Title I schools, have
You're breaking up a little bit, Susana.
funding for parent involvement. So I think that there should be some. I'm sorry. They need to purposely assign some funding for training of parents and involvement of parents, and be very aware that they need to reach out to those parents.
Okay.
Right? Because if you
Susana, you broke up.
Invite them. And they also need to understand that writing flyers is, so making sure that we do the connection there. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
No?
Yes.
Oh, can you hear me if I turn off my camera?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, sharing that, and then also, I think that we need to guide more students towards college as a final destiny. A lot of them their parents don't understand about college, and they think that college is unattainable. So I think giving that information and letting them know that, college, more information about how to go to college and things like that, it's very important. A lot of students don't even get told how to file for FAFSA.
Right. What about you, Frank? Any thoughts on that?
I think Susana really captured it. I mean, we have a section in our report all about educating parents, and just back to my comment about schools need to be advocates and not be quick to dismiss parents when they come with complaints or questions. They're having a hard time navigating the system without people like Susana or Denora or other people on this call. So that's a whole frame shift. It's, I think that's huge. They should not have to go to outside. They should be able to go to the front office, and that front office person should be able to provide all the information, and there should be someone that can speak in their native language to them about it, and they don't have to play guessing games or feel like their student is missing out on opportunities because they're an English learner, right? Another, schools have to be advocates.
That's right. That's right. And that part I think is really important. I know, you know, in my experience, you know, as a child eons ago, in many different countries, if the school wasn't an advocate, my parents weren't really fully informed about what was going on. And and it affected my ability to learn, right? And also it impacted how, even whether I wanted to learn. You know, if my parents weren't welcome, did I really, I started feeling bad about being in the school. So, and that was a thing as well. It had an impact on me as a child. But we're not talking about me here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
One more thing is sometimes school systems overload the ESOL teachers, for example, right? They are expected to become basically social workers to the families.
Oh, yeah.
So that causes burnout on good teachers because
Right.
they overwork somebody, or they use the ESOL teachers as interpreters. And so again, that goes back to funding. There needs to be social workers and something, not just everything gets dumped on the ESOL teachers for the ELL students.
Right. And in our report, we talked about the community health workers and how that could also be a possible, like an additional link that could be effective in addressing gaps. So we only have a few minutes left, and it's a big policy question. If you had a magic wand, what would be the best policy outcomes or the biggest policy outcomes that you think would improve, or that Community Well thinks would improve English language learning in Maryland today? In 2 seconds or less.
Oh my gosh. Susanna, go. And Maria has
just
a
one
question.
word.
I want to skip that and say, Maria, please ask your question. That's a hard one.
I think the issue of racism is always addressed as an adult to adult thing. And I really believe there's a lot of racism in the schools directed to our children. And I don't see people really wanting, you know, they're so hell-bent on glorifying our teachers, which is good, you know, they do good, hard work. But at the same time, we do not discuss what these children are doing to our children, what these teachers are doing to our children, which is, like you mentioned, they're losing hope. Our children are losing hope. They're
That's
losing
the outcome.
self-esteem, you know,
You said it for me.
and we need to address the fact of this is happening to our kids by the people in the system.
That's right.
In the system. And I don't think that's addressed sufficiently.
And that's our next, I think that will be our next session. Because that in and of itself is a huge conversation.
Right.
And it does, like, it's sort of the undercurrent of much of the work that we're doing. Is how do we live how do we build an anti-racist world? How do we build a school system that's anti-racist? How do we, you know, really integrate and love our multicultural selves, right? And appreciate that. So guys, any final words? We have 1 minute left.
Maria said it for me. That's the magic wand. I would wave.
That's
and
the
make
magic
that
wand.
happen.
Okay.
The cultural responsiveness, the anti-racism approach. Absolutely.
Well, wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for your time. Muchas gracias por su tiempo. I am excited to see what we're going to do in 2023, you guys. You know, we're really proud at MLU to be a part of this forum and be a part of Maryland Nonprofits landscape. We're here to serve and keep you informed and engaged. And I certainly learned a lot today. And I just to go back to my opening about Hispanic, I'm not Hispanic Heritage Month. I'm so sorry, Native American Heritage Month. Please use it as an opportunity to find out something new about our Native American neighbors. They're all around us. Sometimes we don't even know it. I am grateful to all of you for being here today, and please sign up for our social media and our newsletter and become members of MLU. We are so happy to have you, and we look forward to many, many, many more discussions and papers and coalition building and fighting racism. Thank you. Have a great day.